Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. My name is Vidya and I will be the host for today's webinar. The topic for today's webinar is the 3 critical C's for online to offline customer acquisitions. And we have Sujit Thomas Zachariah, CEO of Nifty, who will share his how to leverage digital as a mean to attract and acquire customers to the offline stores. So welcome Sujit. I'll just hand over the session to you.
Thanks, Vidya. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity, the Digital Vidya team. So in this talk, what I hope to do is to essentially share more on the online to offline possibilities, convince with both intuition as well as data, and then walk you through some what I believe are 3 critical elements of essentially a successful strategy to essentially acquire customers to your offline stores using digital as a means. To start with, let me just set the context here, and this may be interesting to a lot of you. If you look at the number of searches that are done on Google worldwide in terms of buy online searches, you would notice that there has not been much of a shift. It's not a significant shift over the past 10 years or so. It's fairly flat. In India, where between 2011 and 2014, it was growing. It has been growing, but you also see it kind of flattening off in 2015 and so forth. So this is one aspect on people who are looking to buy online. But what's really interesting is the next slide, which actually contrasts this with the number of people who are doing near me searches. So these are people who are likely to fulfill their buying need in their local vicinity. As you would see worldwide, with the adoption of smartphones and GPS enabled devices, basically there is an exponential growth that has happened in crisscross probably sometime in 2013. And the story in India is just about beginning to happen. Now, I presented this to show that, in fact, if you look at it from a consumer's behavior perspective, there are a lot more people looking at fulfilling their buying needs in their local vicinity than pure play buy online. Right? This is, a proxy for that data, essentially. Now, if that is indeed the case, let us look at some more data before I get to specifics with respect to the elements needed to succeed here. The first one is looking at some data from a mature market like the US, where even after 20 odd years of e-commerce, 92% of retail still happens offline. That might be a surprising number to many of you. And this, it's not uniform across all categories. There are categories in which this would be much lower. But if you look at it on an aggregate basis, it's probably 10% or 10 to 15% online, and the rest is still offline. But what's more interesting is, out of the people who buy offline, there is research from Forrester and BCG and others that show that more than 70% of those people who purchase offline make their decisions online, which is basically the research online and buy offline phenomenon. So the question is, if you are a retail with offline presence, you can definitely be betting on the e-commerce part, which would probably be 8 or 10%. But there is a unique part that you can actually leverage, which is more about the online influenced offline retail, which is a much, much bigger pie, probably 10 times bigger. And this is where we would like to shift the focus of most of the offline retail companies, the companies with the brick and mortar presence. Now, if this is indeed the case, let's purely think of it from a consumer experience perspective. First of all, let's assume you or I do local searches, which is near me. What happens today if you try to do local searches, right? Try mobile phones near wherever your location are, or Chinese restaurants near where you are, like the Bandra or Indira Nagar or Connaught Place. What you will notice is the results are dominated on search engines by the yellow pages, the Judge Dials, the Sulekhas, the Askline of the world, and or the review sites such as the Zomatos, the Burp, and the and similar sites. Now the point I'm trying to make here is there is hardly any brand website, your own presence, that is likely purchase. I mean, the second, let's say some of these results that they're currently shown. What they're likely to see is information that is limits, phone number, and perhaps a scanned menu in Zomato and other cases. But the point here is it's all static information because as a third party you have to acquire this information from a local store, typically through offline methods, and then put it up on your site. Now this limited content is not limited just to search as a discovery channel. Even if you look at social, you would look at a Facebook app and you would realize that there are ability on Facebook mobile app to search for nearby locations and pages. What comes up in nearby searches is actually the Facebook pages of each of the locations in the vicinity, not the brand Facebook pages that the brands typically invest in. And these pages have hardly any data in them, possibly just the name, address, and phone number. Now, the point here is, on one side you have consumers looking for local information. On the other side, there is a big gap in the kind of content that is delivered or the brand's ability to influence its consumers. Now, given this, I would like to now get into the core of my presentation, which is what are actually the three key elements that we believe can make a big difference to helping acquire customers to your local stores. The first one is I'm going to use an intuitive play here. Imagine walking into a store and all you see within the store is pretty much a barren store. Is just a person, a store manager sitting with a POS terminal and nothing else in the store. Now what I'm trying to illustrate here is, imagine a scenario in which you discover a store which doesn't display any information about its products and services, its prices, what is available in the store, but for every interaction, every question, every piece that you want to know about, you have to interact with that store manager. Now the point I'm trying to raise is this is a store that is unlikely to attract any passers-by walking outside, and even the experience while you're in is going to be terrible. So how do we fix this and how is it done in a physical store? There is, in terms of a digital experience that you want to co-create like the one that you have in a store where a consumer can themselves, which is actually their preferred means, looking at products and services, evaluating them, and then asking questions only if needed to the relevant store representative, is an experience that you can actually create online as well. In fact, data again from consumers, and this is from Google, shows that you can actually drive store visits if you can deliver the following information to consumers. The first one is, what is the price of an item, and that too at a nearby store. Number two, is that item currently available in stock? And third one is, if I were interested in a specific product or service, where is the nearest location that I can get it? Of course, there are other elements such as, the details of the store, the maps, and others that are in this list as well. But notice that they are less important to the consumer, and two, they are pretty much available on the web these days. So the point number one, the first C I want to talk about is content. The kind of content that will actually drive customer acquisition. Well, there is a lot of information on inbound and content marketing. The real difference that will make into customer acquisition for local store is this: displaying your live product catalog with live pricing and live availability. Now and this is, I'm showing you an illustrative example, not an illustrative example, a real example of how we do this for a Titan, for example. Without going to an actual store, you can actually browse through the entire catalog. You can actually see the prices. You can actually check on the availability, and this for every individual store across the country. Now, so this addresses the three key questions which I believe must be answered. One is, where can I buy a product or service? Two, what is the price? And third one, is it available? Now, it's one thing to have, let's say we solve this problem, it's one thing to have this content online, but it's another thing to essentially get this content to be discovered by the user. So I'm talking about three different aspects here. One is the depth of the content, which some of the examples I've given here are, products, availability, and pricing. Second one is how frequently is this content being updated. Now, with prices and availability, it is something that we need to keep updated on a regular basis, possibly as near real time as possible. And the third one is really solving the discovery problem. And that by itself is a big issue. So you have to think about methods in terms of not just having this content on your website, but in terms of distributing this, in terms of syndicating this content, and making it discoverable on search engines and Facebook pages and so forth. So that is by itself another aspect of content to make the whole process discoverable. The second C I want to talk about is illustrated using the following graphic. The same store, let's assume you have all products and services displayed, but you don't have a person to actually interact or ask a question. Now that is a frustrating experience unless it is a very transaction-oriented business. A good example of a business that might fall in this category is probably an ATM, where you can walk in, go to a kiosk, and essentially do what you can without actually interacting with a person. But for most retail experiences, you actually need conversations to happen to convert that user into a potential user into a buying customer. And this is my second C, which is enabling conversations. Now when I talk about conversations, there are really two kinds of conversations that you have to enable to enable the customer to convert into, the consumer to convert into a real customer. The first one is enabling communication, preferably real time, between the store and the user. And there are a number of channels and a number of options today, and the more you provide, the more options you provide, the more likely you are to get the customer as quickly as possible. Everything from real-time chat, SMS, phone calls, and email, right? Essentially enabling them not through a customer service center which is centralized, but really one-on-one with your local store. That gives you a better chance of converting the consumer as quickly as possible. The second part to it is essentially enabling conversations peer-to-peer, consumer-to-consumer, about a product or an experience that you have at your local store. And this could include sharing your content via any of the channels are possible these days, and essentially enabling them to get feedback with respect to some of their purchase considerations. So this is my second C that I wanted to talk about in terms of conversations. One important thing that we typically call out with respect to conversations is, it's one thing to enable them, it is another thing to monitor and ensure a fair response. And this is critical with respect to today's age, where people are expecting quicker responses. So it is enabling, monitoring, both calls. You can't have a lot of missed calls that we typically see in a lot of stores. And this is the kind of missed calls that you don't want to see. You can't have a lot of chat conversations that you miss out on and so forth. So it's a balance between your store responsibilities and enabling this to happen. The second C that I really wanted to highlight, and that is conversation. Now the third element. Now imagine this, the virtual store that I'm talking about. You have great products, you have great services, great amount of information, and you have a person there to help you with any related questions, but you don't have an ability to convert that user. Consumer doesn't have the ability to buy at that store. Now this can itself be a frustrating experience, and this is not something that you would experience, you would expect a typical walk-in store. Now the same needs to be viewed at it from an online perspective. Often there are options to discover products, often there are options to contact the store, but ability to convert such users into customers is usually lacking at a local store perspective. Now whenever I talk about conversion online, it doesn't necessarily mean e-commerce. There are a number of ways in which you can actually convert this customer at a local store, but enable that online, and I'll talk about a few examples here. Nevertheless, One, of course, is to enable an e-commerce-like experience from your local store sites. The second one is essentially local delivery, right? Is there an ability for a user to request a cash on delivery in the vicinity of your store, place an order online, and essentially get it delivered to your store? So this is another service that e-commerce services offer, but probably can be done better by local stores. But I want to talk about a few other options that are possible. The third C in this category that I call either convergence or commerce has got a number of options under it. The first one I talked about is e-commerce, then there is local delivery. But notice that there is a big coordination issue between the consumer and the store, whether it is e-commerce or a local store. The first one is the coordination from a distance perspective. How do I deliver as an e-commerce store that is with a warehouse that is sitting miles away to a consumer at a different city? And you would see beyond the traditional supply chain logistics that the e-commerce retailers, e-retailers have, they have now started to tie up with local kirana stores as outlets where consumers can pick up. Or you would have seen like Amazon lockers or like 7-Eleven lockers where the packets are dropped off, the consumers can pick it off at their convenience. So the point here is the problem that you're trying to solve is actually a coordination problem, one in coordination with respect to distance, and second, the coordination with respect to time. Now in this case, what local stores have is essentially an advantage probably with respect to organizing the coordination. So leveraging your proximity to your consumer and ability to coordinate. One example I want to give here is from the Decathlon sports stores, where we've currently enabled essentially a reserve and collect at some of their stores in the country. This means you can browse through the entire product catalog, you can see the price and the availability at a nearby store, and then you can reserve it so that you can pick it up at your own convenience on your way back from work or on a weekend, but you know that the item is available and has been reserved for you. This is a very popular phenomenon in the Western countries, but these are kind of the options that you can look at with respect to enabling the conversion to happen online, leveraging your offline network, your assets that you've invested in across the country. Now, these are the 3 C's that I talked about. So to summarize the C's that I talked about, first, address the content gap. If you think about an e-commerce versus an offline experience, I believe the real difference from a consumer's perspective is not the fact that you can transact and buy online, but that in an e-commerce site, you can actually see the variety, the variance, the prices, the out-of-stock situation, when it will be delivered, and so forth. As an offline store, you should be able to, there's nothing that stops you from delivering that kind of experience online with respect to all this information. And in that process, you first bridge the content gap between an online store and an offline store. Second is enable the consumer to converse and use your offline store representative capabilities before they convert, because in a lot of new customer acquisition cases, the conversation helps with the acquisition. Third, essentially you enable multiple options, enable it and make it as seamless with the customer as you can to convert at a local store, and there are a plethora of options that you can do to essentially make this happen. So these are the 3 C's that I wanted to talk about: content, conversation, and commerce. Now coming to the actual implementation considerations. Now to enable all of this, there are a number of things that need to work together and essentially make this happen. Now if you realize from all the pieces that I've talked together, there's a lot of technology pieces that I've talked about. You start from the product catalog. How do you get the catalog out and the pricing and the inventory stock out of your POS systems or ERP systems, the back-end integrations that need to happen, the front-end experience that need to deliver, the searches that need to be enabled to make it easy for a consumer to just with one click know where an item is available in the vicinity, and then make all of this content discoverable, whether it is local SEO, which is very different from a traditional SEO, search engine optimization, enabling discovery on social pages and so forth. So the key to all of this is essentially a coordinated integration effort, but believe me, it is a one-time significant effort, but it pays off because it gives you a continuous channel of consumers who are already, as I showed you from the data, looking for this, looking to buy in your neighborhood or vicinity. The second part is, once you have put all these basic infrastructure in place to get all this data and present it to the user, there is a lot of monitoring that needs to happen because you're going to get conversations across channels, you're going to get orders, probably pickup requests, a whole bunch of things. So monitoring and essentially fulfillment is another aspect that needs to be in place. And the third aspect, which is a very interesting aspect, is you get a lot of data with respect to what is the products that people are considering in what time of the year. And this is new data that can drive and optimize you on several fronts in terms of, you know, your inventory that you carry at the store, products that you probably should carry or not carrying today, where your store should be located, and so forth. There's a lot of things that you would learn as you go with respect to the data that is provided. And last but not the least, since these are problems that need to be solved for pretty much every offline retail store, there are questions that you need to ask with respect to, you know, are you going to build this full stack by yourself? Essentially, are you going to buy a stack that will do all this for you? Or would you partner with platform providers to enable this to happen? Because there are a lot of pieces of technology that needs to come together. So these are just some considerations that you need to keep in mind. This is pretty much all that I had with respect to the actual presentation. Just as a reminder, as an outline for this presentation, what I was trying to do here is, one, share with you that there is a real online to offline opportunity, and it's going to go very huge soon here in India, and we already see the trends elsewhere. Second one is, there is a broken consumer experience today with respect to an online to offline experience, which is actually preventing them from essentially leveraging the local stores on the digital channels. Third, the content, conversation, and the commerce experiences will actually enable you to bridge this gap and probably acquire a number of customers over the period of time. And last, there are a lot of pieces that need to come together to make this happen. It's not going to happen overnight. There are several considerations that you need to keep in for a strategy to make this happen. With that, I'm pretty much done with my presentation. Back to you, Vidya.
Thank you so much. So everyone, it's time for the questions. You can just type down in the chat panel or in the question panel on the right hand side, and we'll take up all the questions one by one as soon as they arrive. Okay? So I'll just check.
Yeah. So what I suggest is, in the meantime, what I would encourage those with offline stores or those who are working with offline retail stores is essentially take a look at how do your products and services fare in local searches, right? And are consumers really able to discover it, right? You know, you may be a beauty parlor, you may be a retail store, you may be a restaurant, but think about it. If somebody is considering buying shirts or mobile phones in the vicinity, in localities in the city that you are at, and try some searches, and you will discover almost all the cases, 90+%, that it's very hard for you to discover. And then think about it from an actual consumer's experience perspective. What are they actually seeing? They're probably seeing only the name, address, and phone number of a bunch of stores. So familiarizing yourself with the consumer experience would be a good starting point to understand what the limitations are of today's approaches and how you can essentially go about solving this. It gives you a lot more credibility with respect to why you should look at it from an opportunity perspective.
Thank you so much. So let's take up the questions. One is from Raj. He's asking, is there any thorough line bridging offline and online? Even I couldn't.
Is there any bridge between online and offline?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
Is there any line which bridges
there,
offline and online?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So when I'm assuming the bridge is really about what is the area called as attribution. How do you know, for example, a person who viewed your website actually converted at your local store? How do you know if a person who actually looked at a product or service and price and offers and promotions on your store website? One problem you would see the large companies like Facebook and Google look at it from an online to attribution perspective. So there are a number of interesting ways in which you can do that. One is, example, through call tracking. One is essentially looking at, how does calls that are happening from your website coming to your store, and do they actually convert as a consumer? Then there are couponing systems that you can do. There are other attribution systems that you can do. But there are about 3 or 4 types of attribution mechanisms that are used today. So yes, it does handle a subset, but it doesn't handle 100% of the cases. So the answer is yes, there are ways to essentially determine the bridge between online and offline. Calls is one, couponing is another, and there are at least two other methods that can be used, but it definitely doesn't cover 100% of the walk-ins into the store.
Okay, thank you so much. And moving forward to the next question, it's from Madhvi. She's asking, with respect to services, what factors should we consider if you're a service provider?
Can you repeat that? I heard the what factors do we have to consider, but what is this related to?
In related to services.
Oh, services.
Yeah.
Okay, so we do work with a number of services companies, especially beauty parlors and others. The real thing, real essence is again coming back to the basics, right? Imagine a consumer who is interested in a service. I believe the question here says trainings, right? So imagine you're providing computer-related training or digital training. Now think about it purely from a consumer experience perspective. First, as a user, I need to know where I can find maybe a Java training, maybe a, I don't know, CCNA training. Then I need to know what is the pricing. Then I need to know what does the course curriculum cover, what does it not cover. I need to know the duration. I need to know essentially, when does it start next. I need to know are there seats available in your next batch. Now all of this is information that the user needs, and you hardly ever find all of this information online. And often the pricing actually depends on the location. Each center may have a different pricing. And the more transparent you get, the more likely you are to get this user converted as quickly as possible. So it goes back to my first point about the content. What are the key questions that a user is likely to ask before they become your customer? And if you can address all of that as quickly as possible. As I shared earlier, consumers like to make their decisions as much on their own as possible and only interact with the store if it is really required. And that is really what an e-commerce store enables you to do. And I believe an offline store should also try to accomplish the same effect. Okay. Yeah, so that's the content part of it. And the second part is the factors essentially to make sure that this content is discoverable. And there are multiple channels where consumers may be evaluating you, whether it is search, whether it is local and so forth. So you have to make sure that it is discoverable across channels as well. So it's a combination of content and discovery.
Thank you so much. Next question is from Ahipal. He's asking, customer retention or customer acquisition in B2B marketing, which should be preferred?
Customer retention, can you repeat that question, please? I'm not able to see all the questions here.
Is my audio better now? He's asking whether
better. Thank you.
Whether we should switch to customer retention or customer acquisition when it comes to B2B marketing.
It's actually both. I believe it cannot be one or the other, right? Your ability to retain your customer is much higher, assuming your product or service that you provide performs. is much easier than acquiring a new customer. What I was talking about mostly is around acquisition of new customers, who are the ones who are during the research phase essentially using digital as a means to acquire it. But any given day I would essentially not focus on one or the other but both, especially given that retention is much, much easier than acquisition. So priority first, retain your existing customers, make sure your promise or platform or service or performs, and then my talk predominantly was around new customer acquisition. People are looking to discover services, and people who probably are not even aware of you as a brand or you as a local store in their vicinity. So majority of what I talked about today applies to new customer acquisition. But between acquisition and retention, no doubt, both need equal attention or retention needs more.
Yep, absolutely. So moving forward to next question, it's from Gaurav Sharma. So he's asking, when it comes to online to offline conversion, how do we convince the local sellers that going for acquisition over online, customer acquisition over online, and then getting the sale through offline business?
So I heard the first part. So when it comes to online to offline part, I heard that part. What was the second part?
He's asking, how do we convince the local seller? How to convince the local seller that it's better to acquire the customer online and making the sale offline?
Yeah. So this is again, I think, goes back to the attribution issue. The first one is, one, make it discoverable for users. So that itself is a big promise that you can make to local sellers. With respect to the contrasting that to the kind of experiences consumer have today. But there are more convincing methods, and I briefly touched upon one or two online to offline attribution methods. It's the holy grail of online to offline marketing, the attribution aspect. If you show that, or at least 20% of it through the methods that I talked about, there are many ways. We've actually built that into our platform to essentially show the real ROI to the customers who use it. It actually makes it a more convincing reason for customers to adopt it. So the ones I talked about before apply here as well with respect to attribution. I should be able to identify a set of users from my website who actually were on the website, either interacted with my website, let's say there was a form they filled, or they called, and now you have the contact information of the user, and then essentially, you look at actually that user converted to the local store, because most CRM systems these days have the actual information of users with respect to phone numbers and email addresses and so forth. So that's one method that I talked about. But there are about 4 other techniques that you look up, all related to online to offline acquisition. But it's an important point that you should be able to show the ROI with respect to actual users that you uniquely drove out of the online to offline.
Thank you so much. Sanjeev is asking, what are the best tools and strategies for a new startup, and also for segments, some segment which a startup must focus?
Was there a broad question across all startups or in online to offline? I couldn't hear the last part very clearly.
Yeah, it's the last one. Two questions from Sanjeev.
Yeah, one. I'm just looking at the questions here. 1 second, please.
You want me to repeat the question for you?
Yeah, can you do that, please? Because the window here is very small. I'm not able to make out the exact question.
Yeah, so he's asking, what are the best tools or a strategy for a startup? And
yeah,
let's take up this and we'll answer the next question later on.
Okay, so this I'm not, if the startup is around online to offline, then what are a lot of the elements that I talked about should they apply? I'm assuming it's related to the topic, not a broad startup related question. If it is indeed the case, broadly the same should apply, and I will repeat it for the benefit. Think about a potential user or your target user. What do they need to make the decision to convert or become your customer? Right? And essentially, if you're able to convince them with respect to your platform or product or service promise, your pricing, your positioning, how it compares with competitors, how, what is unique and different, all of this content needs to be readily available to them and easily discoverable. Making it readily available is probably the easier part. Making it discoverable is slightly more difficult part. So that's the first part. The second one is essentially, once there is a potential user who might be interested, how do you make it easy for them to essentially onboard or have a conversation with respect to a quick communication? So the principles I don't think are very different from what was shared here so far, whether it is startup or a new retail store around the corner. But the real aspect to it is make it really easy for the user, both in terms of the effort that they need to put in to discover all of the information, and two, with respect to the time that they have to put in to discover that information. It cannot wait till a visit to the store or to a nearby location. It needs to be as seamless as possible to the users. So goes back to my same point. I don't have anything else to add other than make it seamless for the consumer to discover your product, services, prices, neatness, and then make it discovered.
Sure. Thank you so much. Next question is from Milind. He's asking, what sort of product categories can we look at this space? Because not all brands can play here. For example, if I'm buying a car or a shirt or a dinner, the buying cycle is different as my considerations are different.
Is this from Milind, the question?
Yes, it's from Milind.
Okay. So I see a question here, even a mall, I think the first part. Anyway, I'll address the question from whatever I heard. There are a lot of categories, interestingly, that this works in. And this is what is the beauty of this area. If you have an offline store, there is a very high likelihood that people are searching for your category in your vicinity. As a good example, you can look at some of the brands in on our website, and you will see that it's across business verticals. Right? You will see retail, you will see electronics, you will see beauty, you will see food, you will see home improvement, you will see financial services. Across the board, it seems to be a phenomenon. Now, what is interesting is the buying cycles. And in India, if you look at some of the data that is out there, the urgency of buying is much higher than in most other countries. There's some interesting motivation-related aspects that drive a buying need with a much shorter research time, especially in India. And that is something that uniquely happens in India, right? And given that, think about the decision time for a user before they make a purchase cycle is much smaller. Think about shirts. You talked about, I think you mentioned shirts, if I heard it right. Right? Today, if you do a shirts like search and I'm going to give you a few Bangalore examples here. The prominent retail locations here are probably Brigade Road, Commercial Street, Indiranagar, and so forth for fashion-related purchases. And if you type shirts or shirt stores near MG Road, near Indiranagar, or near Commercial, the same problem that I talked about earlier happens. You would see, all the yellow pages show up, and that's pretty much it. Now imagine if you're a shirt buyer, the only information that you have from an offline store is name, address, and phone number. Contrast that with what you can get on a Myntra or a Flipkart or a Snapdeal. You can get sizes, you can get colors, you can get availability, prices, and so forth. Now with what we have enabled for some of our clients, Louis Philippe as an example, try the same search, shirts Indiranagar or shirts MG Road or shirts Commercial Street, and you will see that Louis Philippe does fairly well. And you can actually see availability, you can actually see prices, you can see variants and so forth. It is actually enabling the user, if purely think of it from a user perspective, irrespective of the length of the buying cycle, but most often or not, if they call or if there is the conversion that happens online, they are likely to walk into the store within 50% of them are likely to walk into the store within 24 hours. That's the data that Google has shared. So that's how good the conversion rates are on some of these local searches. So that's the beauty of this category itself. In essence, what I'm trying to say here is, if it's a category that has got local searches, very likely that people are going to walk into your store within 24 hours of those searches.
Thank you so much. Another question from Milind is, he's asking, he saw that Harley Davidson is as a brand you work with. So how do you assist them?
Question is about how do we assist brands, is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, think about brands, right? Your brand, their primary asset is their infrastructure around the country, the outlets around the country. Now the question is, going back to the first slide that I shared, if there are actually a number of searchers who are searching near me for their buying needs. It could be pizzas near me, it could be shirts near me, it could shirt stores near me, it could be beauty parlors near me, or it could even be very granular as in Nokia 6350 near me. The first part is, how do you get the brands to show up for those searches? Second, on the brand's behalf, how do you deliver the best experiences for the consumers so that they convert at the local stores? And all that I talked about applies in the same, in this category of queries as well. You have to enable the user to get the information like, what is the price of the item? Where is the nearest store I can get it at? Is it currently available, real-time availability, and so forth. Now, if you deliver all of this, there is a high likelihood that you can attract that user to your store. And we've built a platform around all the capabilities that we talked about in this presentation that makes it easier for them rather than to build the entire stack. So what we provide from Nifty Windows perspective, that was what the question was about, was essentially provide the full technology platform that makes it seamless for the brands to plug in the information and then deliver the experiences automatically. So that's how we help. At the end of it, you purely look at it from what we deliver for the custom, for the brand clients, leveraging the outlets across the country.
Thank you so much. And the final question from Jagdish, he's asking, is it possible to capture the IP address of customers and then provide him or her with local city level store information and along with the availability?
Yeah, there are privacy issues to certain elements of doing what you can. There are snoopers, there are people using MAC addresses and so forth. But they're all dependent on certain, beacon technology, Bluetooth being on, Wi-Fi being on, and so forth. There are ways in which those are being done as well. So when a person with a smartphone accesses a website and then essentially walks in, the MAC addresses or other mechanisms can be used to detect if it's the same user who has walked in and so forth, but definitely not IP address. It will probably be more at the device level. But there are a lot of privacy issues around that and so forth. And it also is dependent on the number of people who have their Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and all turned on while they are at the local store. So it's conditional to a lot of these other things. So the answer is yes, some of these techniques can be used, but there are a lot of other concerns around it that need to be addressed itself, especially when you work with large brands.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sujit, for this lovely session which we had today. Thank you for taking your time
Thanks,
out.
Vidya, for the opportunity.
No problem. It was our pleasure to have you at the webinars for Digital Vidya.